Well, I don't think we're going to necessarily ask for a declaration of war. I think we're just going to kill people that are bringing drugs into our country. Okay? We're going to kill them. You know, they're going to be like dead.
Donald Trump has what he calls the narco-state of Venezuela firmly in his crosshairs. He sent down to his coastline the largest deployment of US naval assets since the Cold War, initially to chase down drug runners, but he is now reportedly also given the green light to CIA operations inside the country. Venezuela is a democracy, on paper at least, but it operates more like a dictatorship. For the last 12 years, it's been run by the firebrand socialist Nicolas Maduro. His political opponents live in hiding or in exile. In fact, the country's main opposition leader has just been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts to challenge him. Since the US began its military campaign in August, on somewhat questionable legal grounds, it must be said, it's killed more than 81 in at least 21 missile strikes on fast boats heading in the US's direction, some of which have appeared to be packed full of drug bales. Maduro, though, remains defiant, and he is not only gathering all the military might he can muster, spoiler alert, not that much, but also gave a rendition of John Lennon's Imagine at a public rally last weekend.
Peace. Peace, peace. Hacer todo por la paz. Como decía John Lennon, ¿no? Alfred Nazaret, ¿cómo era la canción de John Lennon? Imagine us people.
Singing protests aside, what is crystal clear now is Trump wants him gone and has assembled a massive military presence to threaten his removal by force. So what are the options available to the US president? And could it all end up backfiring on him? I'm Tom.
And I'm Patrick. Welcome to the General and the Journalist. So, Tom, you've been watching this story closely over the last few months. Just talk me through what is, by any measure, a pretty extraordinary military build-up in the US's backyard.
So it began in August, a series of US Navy ships dispatched to the Southern Caribbean on what the US government said, the Pentagon said, was a counter-narcotics mission. Trump's claim that Venezuela is the epicenter of the fentanyl problem in the US, the huge Class A drug addiction problem. It's actually not, because most of the fentanyl comes into the US via Mexico, but that's Trump's claim. So at the start of September, the missile strikes on these sort of fast boats, these drug boats, began. And there was absolutely no attempt to take any prisoners or interdict or arrest anyone. And just to add to the drama, the War Secretary, as we must now call him rather than Defense Secretary, the US War Secretary, Pete Hegseth, would regularly tweet out the videos of these strikes going in and destroying the boats in great balls of flame. So by September, we had about 9 warships down there, including something called the USS Iwo Jima, which is a vast, great big helicopter landing dock, packed full, by the way, of some 2,000 heavily armed US Marines. That is a pretty potent weapon as itself, as are, by the way, the other 8 warships alongside it. And it really became fairly clear, I think, to all of us that this wasn't just going to be a drug running operation. I mean, a drug running operation, you remember, Patrick, when the Royal Navy goes after drugs boats in the Caribbean, there's a frigate, perhaps 2 on these sorts of things. They've got vast reach, they have helicopters. You don't need 9 whacking great warships and 2,000 heavily armed US Marines. So I guess that's when the penny started dropping for most of us. There's something else going on here. And also, by the way, another clue, interestingly, around that time in late August, the US also doubled the bounty for the arrest and or conviction of Maduro. He's been a wanted man in the US for a long time for, they say, completely falsifying the last presidential election. A lot of UN observers would agree with that. So he's a wanted man. They doubled the bounty on his head from $25 million to $50 million. And that put him in the same category, wanted category, bounty, as Osama bin Laden. So the build-up continued, and then we get to mid-November, a couple of weeks back, and a warship familiar to, I'm sure, a lot of people, Patrick, the USS Gerald R. Ford was dispatched.
I've been on board, Tom.
What's it like?
Big.
That's eloquent. Anything else?
I mean, it's impressive. It's hard not to be. I was on board her when she was in the Solent, and you know, it was almost as if there was a second Isle of Wight between the Isle of Wight and Portsmouth.
I remember the pictures, actually. The pictures were striking, weren't they? And the wind just dropped on anything that tried to sail anywhere near the thing, because it would stop the wind as well. So It was announced by the Pentagon that the Gerald 4, this huge aircraft carrier, carries 90 different aircraft, F-18s, helicopters, reconnaissance jets, the lot. That this thing was on its way with its escort group, by the way, 3 more warships. It was actually alongside in Croatia, and it was urgently dispatched, sailing very fast out of the Mediterranean and across the Atlantic.
And that is against all of the flow of previous deployments. So traditionally, I mean, the US, clearly have a lot of carrier strike groups and a very large navy. But even with the US's size, with their global presence, there's always wrangling between the different combatant commands. And often the combatant commands that are favored are, CENTCOM covering the Middle East, INDOPACOM covering the Indo-Pacific, sometimes EUCOM, but almost never Southcom. So to send a carrier strike group of this size from the European theatre across to Southcom's theatre is, I can't remember it ever happening before.
No, it's unheard of. It's the sort of thing you do. You dispatch an aircraft carrier when there is a war just about to begin. It's that serious. So where are we now? In and around the southern Caribbean, just off the northern coast of Venezuela. All in, you've got 15,000 US troops, 15 different warships, including the Ford. That's a total of some 300,000 tons of shipping. And all that adds up to about a third of all deployable US naval assets and a force the size of a small country's entire military. In short, Patrick, an extraordinarily powerful strike package capable of land, sea, air operations. In fact, it can do pretty much everything, really, apart from armor, apart from tanks.
Yeah, and I'm just going to repeat what you said. That is 30% of the US deployed fleet focused on Venezuela. That's extraordinary. So you've got this incredible military presence, almost unbeatable military presence, bearing down on Venezuela. How have they responded?
Well, with some fear. And, that may just be the point of all this, to intimidate, to pressurize, etc. The Venezuelan government, under Maduro, has announced a mass mobilization and deployment of all their forces, all their major formations, their riverboats, their armies, etc., all the way down to paramilitary groups, which they say they're now busy training. Venezuela's armed forces, though, let's be honest, they're not exactly the best. There's about 100,000 regulars in uniform, roughly 200,000 or so more paramilitary irregulars, but a lot of their equipment is aging. They relied on the Soviet bloc to equip and supply them. And they've asked for Russia's help. So they've said, we really need your help. You're one of our oldest allies. Certainly Venezuela has the closest links of any country in South America to Russia and what was formerly the old Soviet Union. And interestingly enough, the Russian Foreign Ministry said, in a very playful way perhaps, we'll listen to that, sure. They can see a bit of leverage here as well for Putin, his deliberations with Trump elsewhere. And fascinatingly, about 2 weeks back, a giant Ilyushin 76, one of the huge, great, big, vast old Soviet carrier transport jets, was seen landing in Caracas. We don't know what was in it. We don't know if it was a big bluff. We've no idea. But it's another very, very interesting element coming to play.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that Russia can actually afford to send anything really significant, given what they're facing in Ukraine at the moment. Okay, well, that's what's happened so far, Tom. But are Nicolas Maduro's days numbered? To answer this, I've spoken to Ryan Berg, the director of the Americas program at the Center for Strategic International Studies, or CSIS, and here is our conversation. So Ryan Berg is the head of the Future of Venezuela initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the General and the Journalist, Ryan.
Thanks very much for having me, Patrick. It's great to be here.
So Tom and I were talking earlier on about the military buildup in the waters off Venezuela, and it's pretty formidable. But before we sort of get into the whys and the whats and the wherefores, could you just give our audience, who may not be entirely familiar with Venezuela, a thumbnail sketch of Venezuela and its politics?
Well, Venezuela is size-wise about twice the size of the U.S. state of California. It's a sizable country. Population slightly over 30 million, although somewhere in the realm of 8 million Venezuelans have left since about 2015 in order to find refuge and livelihoods elsewhere. It's the largest migration movement in the world outside of a conflict context. There's no war raging in Venezuela. There's nothing but repression and bad economic policies. But nevertheless, Venezuelans, of course, have had to leave and find livelihoods elsewhere. And strategically, Venezuela is situated at the gateway, if you will, to South America. an incredibly resource-rich, resource-endowed country with the largest proven reserves of oil in the world, bounties of natural gas and critical minerals. So it's a very important country in the region. And over the last 26, now 27 years, it has been ruled by an ideology called Chavismo, which takes after the former president and ex-military official Hugo Chavez, who won the election in 1998, was a popular figure for a period of time, also a populist, who essentially took Venezuela's oil reserves and all the money that Venezuela was making from oil and turned it into one large buffet for Venezuelan officials to plunder over the years. And so we estimate Venezuelan officials have stolen hundreds of billions of dollars from Venezuela, mostly through the state-owned oil company, PDVSA, and started engaging in other sundry criminal activities like drug trafficking, illegal gold mining, human trafficking, and so on. And so that kind of brings us up to the present day in terms of what the current administration's interests are in Venezuela, why it's so intently focusing on Venezuela, how its interests more broadly in drug trafficking, countering migration, competing with China, pushing out Russia and Iran from the region. All of those things intersect with Venezuela. And so you kind of have the perfect storm with Venezuela in terms of the administration's interest in this country and what's driving it.
So, I mean, I was about to ask you what U.S. vital interests are engaged in Venezuela. I mean, you've described that in a very sort of short list there. I mean, for those of us who are watching from afar, what we've seen is this being dressed up as a war on narcos. But recently, we've been hearing statements that it's much broader than that, in a way that you were hinting at there. And this sort of gets into hemispheric defense and security. I think, as I heard someone say earlier on today, it's about getting Russia and China and Iran out of the Western Hemisphere. Why now, and what's behind it?
Well, to a certain extent, I think Venezuela is unfinished business from Trump's first term, Patrick. We saw in Trump's first term a pressure campaign, which the administration then began to call maximum pressure. And that pressure campaign consisted of an architecture of sanctions, 400 or so, over 400 sanctions on individuals, entities, sectors, specifically the oil sector, or especially the oil sector in Venezuela, in order to bring the regime down by suffocating its financial resources and also isolating it diplomatically. The second thing is, in terms of how I would classify the administration's interests, or how I would prioritize, rather, the administration's interests in Latin America, I would say it's drugs, migration, and great power competition. Venezuela ticks all those boxes. So I would argue, Patrick, that the focus on Venezuela is very much warranted in the sense that all of the administration's priorities really are at play here, especially drug trafficking. Right next door to Venezuela is Colombia, the largest coca producer in the world. There is a lot of cocaine, record amounts of cocaine these days being produced in Colombia. A lot of that is transiting through Venezuela, and the regime is making money on that. What is different about this regime, Patrick, is that it operates more like a cabal, like a network of individuals and a mafia than it does a government. So,
like a cartel.
Like a cartel, and that is the administration's claim, is that there is a cartel that has taken root within the government of Venezuela, within the regime in Venezuela, and much of the state resources, airstrips that are run by the military, naval ports, warehouses, these kinds of things are used to move drugs, and the regime makes money on it. We estimate last year, we being CSIS estimate last year, Venezuela made about $8 billion selling drugs or allowing drugs to move through Venezuela. That's about as much money as Venezuela made last year selling its oil, right? So you can see how the regime is complementing its sale of sanctioned oil with sale of and transit of illicit drugs. And that's to say nothing of its participation in human trafficking networks, illegal gold, timber, wildlife, sundry criminal activities. And so the administration's argument is that counter-narcotics operations are tantamount to pressuring this regime to leave power, because this really is a criminal regime that's taken root in the Western Hemisphere, 600 miles from the US mainland.
So let's just stay with the drugs theme for a second. I mean, and you'll correct me because I'm sure these figures aren't perfect, but doing a little bit of research into this, Venezuela isn't really engaged with supply of fentanyl, which is clearly Trump's obsession, but it is engaged in supply of cocaine, but it pales into insignificance compared to what, as you say, comes from Colombia. It's 400 tons is what I found, as opposed to about 2,660 tons from Colombia. I mean, you've described very eloquently the other reasons why, but why this single-minded focus on what the administration has described as narco-terrorism?
I think that I would answer that question in two parts. The first is, we saw the campaign against counter-narcotics or against suspected drug boats begin in the Southern Caribbean, but it didn't end there. And so note that some of the strikes that have taken place, in fact, almost all the strikes that have taken place most recently, have started or have been in the Pacific. And those have been against drug vessels that are likely coming out of either Ecuador or Colombia. So while the paradigm shift that the Trump administration has signaled on some of these drug-carrying vessels began in the Southern Caribbean around the waters near Venezuela, it's a paradigm that they have now moved into other parts of the Western Hemisphere. So I would note that it's not just focused on Venezuela, although the pressure on the government itself is what makes this slightly different. And I think that is because you can't do counter-narcotics cooperation with this government. It isn't the Colombian government. It isn't the Ecuadorian government. It isn't the Mexican government. While those relationships are sometimes testy, especially our current relationship with Colombia, we have had a long-standing relationship with all three of those governments on the counter-narcotics front, usually more or less a cooperative one. You can't have that kind of relationship with the Venezuelan government when they're so deeply embedded in drug trafficking. And so that's what makes it, I think, qualitatively different, even if quantitatively you've got more cocaine leaving from Colombia, more cocaine leaving from Ecuador.
That's really interesting. So, and I hadn't appreciated that actually. You framed it really well. So when you look at what the current Trump's administration are trying to achieve, and they're being quite vague. Up until now, it's been all about going after narco-terrorism. There's now a description of sort of broadening that lens, and we'll talk about that in a second. But do you think you can describe what a successful end state to this current campaign against Venezuela looks like?
I think the most ideal end state, Patrick, would be Maduro leaving of his own volition. Deciding that it's not worth putting up a fight, deciding that the U.S. pressure is credible and that the security of his regime is at risk, and deciding to leave on his own terms in a negotiated exit, and finding refuge and exile in Havana, in Managua, in Moscow, going to be Assad's neighbor potentially. He needs a friend to play video games with, apparently. Maybe to go to Qatar or to Turkey. Those are two places that have been seriously considered in the past as potential destinations for exile. It's pretty easy to talk about that stuff. It's a lot harder to actually get to it. You need to credibly offer a safe passage to a dictator like that. You need to credibly offer that the sanctions on him will be lifted. You need to credibly offer that the $50 million reward for his capture will be lifted. You need to find a jurisdiction that isn't going to turn him over to the International Criminal Court, because there's a criminal court case against him as well for crimes against humanity. We haven't talked about the human rights abuses that have taken place in Venezuela, but part of what's driven the 8 million to leave Venezuela is a pretty heavy amount of repression. Yeah. So another outcome here could be that there is a regime change, but a lighter form of regime change. So Maduro goes, but somebody else from the same system takes over. Say a regime change light, you might call this. So somebody who is part of the same coterie of individuals, but maybe not as bad as Maduro, not as involved in criminal activities, not as implicated in human rights abuses, could take over. You could have the military take a play, make a play at filling the power vacuum and taking over. The Minister of Defense, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, has, I think, had designs on power for a while. Many coups in Latin America come from lower on the rungs than the general level. A lot of them come from the colonel level. In other words, from the barracks. So it could be somebody we've never heard of who tries to take the reins, or it could be the most satisfactory of outcomes, I think, for the United States, which would be the military realizing that the game is up and that they need to stand on the side of a democratic transition, which would mean honoring the election results of last July 2024, where the opposition credibly confirmed and showed to the entire world that it beat Maduro in an election, in an unfree and unfair election. They still managed to win by a ratio of over 2-1. That would be quite a satisfactory outcome. You'd have a legitimate, democratically elected government in Venezuela. You'd have a government that ideally wouldn't be participating in all these criminal activities, and you'd have a government that would want to partner with the United States on a counter-narcotics as opposed to oppose it and participate in these activities. And then there's a whole bunch of other things that could come from such an arrangement, where the U.S. could help Venezuela rebuild. The opposition has been messaging that there's $1.7 trillion of deals that could potentially be on the table, Patrick. Oil, gas, critical minerals, all things that speak to President Trump's economic concerns. And then lastly, much less China, much less Russia, much less Iran and Hezbollah in a place like Venezuela under opposition control.
I mean, let's talk now about how, because what we're seeing visibly playing out in front of us is the military instrument. And how does this deployment, and I've been on the Gerald R. Ford myself. I mean, this is a formidable military force that's been deployed. I think 30% of US deployed naval assets are now concentrated in your backyard, which is a first as far as I can remember. How can that be used to achieve, and I'm going to throw two quotes at you. So James Story, who you'll know, former US ambassador to Venezuela, said that this is about exile him, extradite him, or send him to meet his maker. And Maria Corina Machado, opposition leader and the recent Nobel Prize winner, said Maduro started this war and Trump is finishing it. With or without negotiation, Maduro is leaving. I mean, how does the presence of this carrier strike group contribute to achieving that outcome?
We went from about 10, 15% of US Navy's deployed assets all of a sudden up to 30. And in my mind, you don't move that type of equipment from a mission in EUCOM where it was there to deter Russia, but also potentially to play a role if the Houthis had started acting up again, or if there was an Iran contingency in CENTCOM, right? Having it parked in the Med where it was a strategic position for the Gerald R. Ford. You don't move it unless you intend to seriously consider options to use it. And to your earlier point, Patrick, this is not a counter-narcotics vessel, okay? A U.S. aircraft carrier is a floating fortress of U.S. power projection. It doesn't get much more intimidating than this. What I think that does, Patrick, is that it sets the shot clock. So the time that the clock is ticking at the moment, because things happen in the world, contingencies arise, issues become acute, things could pull that carrier away to other theaters of the world. And secondly, you know very well that the competition for these types of vessels is intense among COCOM commanders. So you will have the commander of CENTCOM, the commander of INDOPACOM, the commander of AFRICOM, probably making a very strong case internally for that asset to be in their theater, right? And not in SOUTHCOM, because it's usually not there, because it's not needed, whatever arguments they're making. So in my estimation, this thing has about 2 months or so in the region. And if by mid to late January, it hasn't been used, in my opinion, it's likely to be moving on.
So how's it going to be used?
Either as that floating platform of power projection. So park it, say, equidistant between Puerto Rico and Caracas, Venezuela, and you can use it for endless runs of fighter aircraft, as opposed to flying them all the way back to Puerto Rico. You can have them land on the carrier. You can have them do logistics and resupply. From there, it basically just forward positions the United States even closer. The other thing that it could be used for is for its standoff and precision guided munitions capabilities. With the arrival of the Ford, the U.S. has about 200 or so Tomahawks, just shy of 200 Tomahawk precision guided munitions in the Southcom AOR between all the various vessels. That's on par with about the amount of Tomahawks we had in other short conflicts that the United States has been involved in, say Operation Rough Rider with the Houthis earlier this year under the second Trump administration, or even Operation Midnight Hammer when the U.S. Leveraged or utilized Tomahawks from the CENTCOM area of responsibility. It too had about that number of Tomahawks. And we could see a repeat of that kind of thing here in Venezuela, in my opinion. The theory of the case, Patrick, I think is super important, which is if you strike targets that are at the heart of this state criminal nexus that I've been describing of how the state in Venezuela participates in drug trafficking, gold trafficking.
So this is the theory of victory.
This is the theory of victory. This is the theory of how you get to that democratic opposition taking power in Venezuela, or how you get to a point where there could be a transition beginning, is you hit those types of targets that are right there at that nexus. And the military realizes that the game is up. The theory of the case is that these guys have never been in a war before. The history of modern Venezuelan army, they've never been in a war before. And when the missiles start falling on their facilities, they will flip sides. They will realize that the game is up, and they will realize that their future is probably better off if they switch sides, turn on Maduro, hand him in exchange for immunity, for some kind of constitutionally guaranteed role for their institution to continue to exist under any democratic transition. And it shouldn't be lost on them, it probably isn't, that the last two times the United States intervened in Latin America in this kind of way, Operation Just Cause in 1989 to overthrow the then dictator of Panama, Manuel Noriega, and in 1994, Operation Uphold Democracy, when the United States reinstalled the Aristide government in Haiti. In both of those cases, Patrick, the U.S. decided to dissolve the armies of those two countries. So what's at stake for the Venezuelan armed forces is actually its existence. That's the message that I think the administration is sending. Will you act in the interest of self-preservation?
And how is this being augmented? So we've heard a bit, ironically, about covert CIA activity. I mean, I'm sort of always struck by the irony of announcing covert CIA activity, but there's obviously a fair bit going on. And there are plenty of examples where this hasn't worked and where it has worked. Mossadegh is the case that we always look back to. Is that a complementary effort, or is it something that can work on its own?
It seems the Trump administration is keen to see if it can work on its own before it engages in kinetic strikes. So we're recording this podcast on November 24th. Just today, the United States has designated the Cartel de los Soles as a foreign terrorist organization. That's the cartel that it alleges is comprised of senior members of the Venezuelan government, the Venezuelan regime of Nicolas Maduro. And so we're entering what the Trump administration calls phase 2 of this campaign against Venezuela. Phase 1 was the military buildup. Phase 1 was the mapping of Venezuelan military installations. Phase 1 was the bomber simulation flights. Phase 1 was the intimidation tactics. Phase 2 is not just the foreign terrorist organization designation for some of these key groups, which I think is a prerequisite for any kinds of kinetic strikes in Venezuela, but it's also the start, so we're told, of CIA activities. Let me just give you one example of what the CIA said that they could do, which I think could have an impact. In the first Trump administration, they were preparing a plan to hack Venezuela's banking system and to freeze bank accounts of military officials and essentially to block monthly payments to members of the military until such time as they stood on the side of a democratic transition. Not a horrible idea from a covert operations standpoint, right? Not a horrible idea if you're interested in getting this critical institution to stand on the side of a democratic opposition. But the CIA slow walked the plan and never in the end executed it. That's the kind of thing that could potentially move the needle if it were executed well.
Yeah. So what you were describing just a second ago was a campaign of precision strikes, precision targeting to try to destabilize the regime, coupled with covert activities from the CIA. And it could work. I mean, this could be an incredibly brittle regime in the way that these autocratic regimes often are.
They tend to look strong until they fall.
Yeah,
it's like
exactly.
that line in Ernest Hemingway, one of Ernest Hemingway's books.
Exactly.
How did you go broke? Slowly, then all at once.
Yes, yeah. Gradually and then suddenly. It's one of my favorite quotes.
Yeah.
I use it all the time. What you haven't mentioned, because of course there's a MU present, so a land force present. Is there any future in which you see land forces intervening in Venezuela from the US and from the Marines who are on this carrier strike group, or do you think the MAGA base is just not there?
I don't think the MAGA base is there yet, and they may never get there. And Americans are, in my opinion, rightly skeptical of regime change operations, given the lessons that we've learned in Iraq and Afghanistan, to an extent, Libya. These are seen by many Americans as not achieving U.S. strategic objectives and costing a lot in terms of blood and treasure. So I think there is a significant component of this where the president does greenlight strikes on Venezuela. He does need to consider closely American public opinion and how far Americans are willing to go with him on this kind of counter-narcotics, counter-Maduro campaign. And my thought at this point in time is that it's an air campaign for the most part. It's not boots on the ground. We've seen the training exercises that the Marine Expeditionary Force is doing in Puerto Rico. That is allegedly for the potential for a kill or capture mission against Maduro. But that is a very significant risk. That's a very high level of risk appetite that I don't think the Trump administration is keen on for now. My thought is if we see action on Venezuela, it's likely to be precision-guided munitions from a safe distance, not risking the lives and the livelihoods of U.S. service personnel. And this, I think, fits with President Trump's modus operandi and other actions of a similar nature. I mentioned Operation Rough Rider. I mentioned Operation Midnight Hammer. These are very short actions that had significant consequences, but were very short.
So Ryan, I want to try and get into the legal framework for this, and neither you nor I are lawyers, so this could be a sort of idiot's dialogue. But let's have a go. So let's take us back to the drugs focus. So in the last few months, I think there have been 21 strikes on boats in international waters. We hear about 80 people killed. The administration claims that those boats were carrying drugs, but there's no evidence being released to the public. And we're also hearing claims that the administration isn't really interested in interdiction. It's just interested in sinking the boats. Now, sinking these boats in the way that we've seen is the use of deadly force as a tool of first resort, as opposed to a tool of last resort. And that suggests that the administration is applying the law of armed conflict instead of law enforcement, which up until now has been the legal paradigm that I think all of us, certainly the Royal Navy, and I think the US as well, has used against narcotic cartels in the past. So we're conducting status-based targeting. We're assuming that that the people driving those boats are combatants. They're presenting a direct threat to the United States. Is any of this actually legal?
Well, the administration has constructed a legal framework for what they're doing. The Office of Legal Counsel has issued an opinion and set up exactly the kind of construct that you've discussed. Is that their argument is that we are in an armed conflict with drug cartels. What they say is that we are in a non-international armed conflict with drug cartels.
Same as Al Qaeda, same as ISIS.
That's exactly right, and they'll point to the precedent that was set by the Obama administration for strikes on land using drones against suspected terrorists, Al Qaeda and ISIS, and they'll point to that and say nobody had an issue about these strikes. What would, including in some cases against Anwar al-Awlaki, who was a U.S. citizen, right, born in the United States, and killed in a drone strike in Yemen, if I'm not mistaken. So they will point to those precedents and say we've had other scenarios where we've said we're in an armed conflict against a particular group, but in this case they're calling it a non-international armed conflict, and so they're saying they're actively saying we're not in the paradigm of a law enforcement situation. We're in the paradigm where the Air Force and the Navy are in the lead, and the laws of armed conflict apply here. And in the rhetoric, I also find it interesting, the rhetoric of the defense secretary, the rhetoric of the secretary of state, explicitly invoking, right, ISIS and Al Qaeda. There have been multiple statements where both of those gentlemen have said that these groups represent the ISIS and the Al Qaedas of the Western Hemisphere, and we're intent on eradicating them.
The media is used to hearing that when it pertains to Afghanistan and Iraq and ISIS and Al Qaeda. But if you reframe how you understand the world in our own hemisphere, that's exactly what these foreign terrorist organizations are. And so we will track them, we will map them, we will network them, and we will hunt them and kill them because they're trying to, and they are killing and poisoning the American people.
So partners have disagreed. We've heard that the British have had issues with our actions. There's some reporting about British intelligence not wanting to partner with the United States, at least in some areas of the Western Hemisphere. Intelligence sharing.
I think to spare her blushes, the Foreign Secretary's back has walked away from that. But you're right, it was certainly reported.
It was reported, and we Secretary Rubio at the G7 denied that was the case, and now it seems as though British authorities have also walked back that statement. But nevertheless, let's just say it's partners are disagreeing with the approach. But that's at least the administration's theory of the case, right? Is that the laws of armed conflict apply here? And just to further this one step further, to push this one step further, the administration says this is a war just like any other because there's a death toll. Predictably, every year Americans die, between 70 and 100,000 Americans for the last decade plus. Of drug overdoses. They will point to that and say that's a death toll, just as if we were in active conflict. Interdiction, they've argued, doesn't work because groups plan to lose between 2 and 5% of their profit every year, and they still bring in billions. And so what they're trying to do, I think, is set up a model that can actually dissuade and deter drug trafficking groups from engaging in the behavior and pushing the products that they push. It's a really difficult task because the U.S. is the largest drug market in the world, and the drug market is incredibly lucrative. So there's a lot of incentive to get out in the Southern Caribbean, even with all the risks, in a fast boat or in a speedboat and try to push drugs.
It's certainly stretching international humanitarian law. I mean, for balance, I think there are plenty of commentators and legal experts out there who would say that the difference between Al Qaeda and ISIS and a drugs cartel is that ISIS and Al Qaeda set out to destroy the United States. There was no doubt what their intentions were, whereas the intentions here are around drug trafficking. It's not the same thing, and therefore that doesn't make them combatants. But neither you nor I are qualified necessarily to make these judgments.
I think there's a similar claim being made here with drugs. This is the final point I'll make: is the administration continues to refer to it as poison, and that's kind of the parallel there with the intent of ISIS and Al Qaeda. But suffice it to say, there's a lot of legal nuances here, and the administration is pushing very new legal concepts and ideas here. And if I had studied law, I'd be much more qualified to comment on them. But that's the extent of what I understand in terms of the administration's legal architecture here.
And what's interesting is that the the organization that they're targeting, and under the law of armed conflict, you have to be targeting an organized armed group, is the Cartel de los Soles, or the Cartel of the Suns. And as I understand it, this is a Venezuelan nickname, a pejorative term for those elements in the regime who wear suns on their shoulders. So where I wore a star, or my US counterparts wore a star, they wear suns. And this is just a description of the regime, or parts of the regime itself. So it feels like it's almost a pretext to go after the regime. I mean, does that strike a chord with you?
It certainly strikes a chord, and it also gets to the earlier argument that I made that pressuring Maduro is tantamount to doing counter-narcotics, because this is a regime comprised of individuals who are involved in the same activity. So in order to get after this activity, you have to pressure the regime. You have no chance of reducing drug trafficking from Venezuela if you don't actually go after the regime. I think that's the argument, that he's effectively the head of a cartel that has taken power in Venezuela.
So does the designation of the Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of the Suns, as a foreign terrorist organization provide the administration with the legal cover it needs to politically intervene in Venezuela? I mean, it puts, as we've been talking about, it puts the cartel in the same category as AQ and ISIS.
I think it's another step on that path. The administration said to members of Congress about 2 weeks ago now, again, we're recording on November 24th, when Secretary Hegseth and Secretary Rubio went over to Capitol Hill to do some briefings for senators. They told them, allegedly in that briefing, we don't have the legal architecture in place to do strikes within Venezuela right now. We feel good about our legal architecture, what we just talked about, for strikes in international waters against these suspected drug vessels. We don't think we have the legal construct yet for land strikes in Venezuela. My understanding is that they are working on that, and we'll probably get that announcement sometime soon. But I think one important step along the way is the designation of the Cartel de los Soles as part of that march to potentially greenlighting strikes on Venezuela. It's all part, I think, of building the legal architecture in the case that Venezuela is this criminal regime that is involved in these activities.
I mean, the other route they could take is to designate Venezuela as a state sponsor of terrorism, but they haven't chosen that route. I mean, do you have a sense of why not?
They haven't chosen that route yet. It's one of the things that I think was being discussed. However, I think the evidentiary standards and also the amount of time that process takes is much longer than the timeline that we're working on here. That's my understanding. And so it might not fit the timeline of the operations the same way an FTO designation would.
Okay. So I want to zoom out and bring this to a close, but there are so many historical echoes here. I mean, President Monroe's, what's the word I'm looking for? Eponymous doctrine, the Monroe Doctrine, followed by that subsequent gunboat diplomacy by President Roosevelt. Is what we're seeing an echo of that? The emergence of a new doctrine, the Dunn Doctrine, where the president is pivoting to, or setting out a strategy of hemispheric defense. Instead of an east-west perspective on the world, you suddenly start to see a north-south perspective. And is it a doctrine, or is it just transactional opportunism?
I don't think that these are super fruitful activities right now to be thinking about what is the doctrine that guides President Trump's thinking on this. I think he's a very instinctual politician, right? He's a gut politician. He's someone who probably isn't guided by these kind of grand doctrines the same way Monroe or Roosevelt may have been. What I do think he understands, though, is that the U.S., in order to be a globally influential power, has to be a regionally influential power. I teach international relations at the university level. That's kind of like IR 101, and that's not even IR 101, but that's kind of like day one of IR 101. is like, how do countries become globally influential? Well, first they become the regional top dog, right? And I think that there's an abiding sense within this administration, especially, that the U.S. has focused much further afield in the last 20 years. It's neglected its own hemisphere. It's neglected the place that, in their opinion, impacts the daily lives of Americans more than other geographies of the world. And so there is that sense that we need to focus, I think, more on home. We need to have a new doctrine of hemispheric defense. It involves reasserting U.S. influence over the Western Hemisphere. And what dovetails with that is, of course, getting China out, or reducing Chinese influence, extricating China where we can. Because the other abiding sense that I gather from this administration is, while the U.S. has been focused on other geographies of the world, that neglect of its own shared neighborhood has accrued to China's gain, especially in countries like Venezuela, which are big hubs of Chinese influence. So I think that is mostly what's guiding them, not an idea of we need to return to a Monroe Doctrine 2.0. Again, I think the president is much more of an instinctual politician than that, but the instincts that are guiding him are ones that could potentially dovetail with a Monroe Doctrine, in the sense that, you know, he wants the U.S. to be the number one power in the Western Hemisphere. And the current competitor is no longer the Europeans and the European colonial project that was trying to return to the Western Hemisphere, but the People's Republic of China.
So I think I completely buy your diagnosis that Trump doesn't have, he's not a guy that does doctrines. But to execute instincts still requires strategy. And since we're talking about China, I can't help but bring up a bit of Sun Tzu and that great phrase, strategy without tactics is the long road to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. Is there a strategy here? And we've seen the hollowing out of the deep state, the expertise that people like you represent that often serve in US administrations. And military force alone can't achieve this. If you're going to win over the Southern Hemisphere, if you're going to make it, a supportive backyard, there has to be more than bullying. There has to be economic incentives. There has to be political alignment. Do you see any evidence of that?
The one thing, you've hit on it, the one thing that the administration is missing to have their strategy be truly comprehensive is more of the carrot. The stick is firmly established. The desire to increase U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere, to build up the military influence in the Southern Caribbean, the deployments, all of that is readily apparent. It's clear to many leaders in the region. The U.S. is back, and it's likely back in a way that's going to be more or less permanent. Look at the reopening of naval ports and runways and other military installations in places like Puerto Rico. Again, hearkening back to your earlier point of policies that were first implemented by Teddy Roosevelt. But the long-term focus has to be on how do we entice countries to once again want to trade with us, want to engage with us on the economic side. How do we use carrots in addition to sticks in order to get after some of those forms of long-term Chinese influence that have been so detrimental to the United States, what we call coercive or sharp power, ways in which engagement on seemingly anodyne issues like the soy trade between Brazil and China all of a sudden snowball into Chinese influence over Brazil's ICT sector policy. And all of a sudden you've got Huawei as a 50+% ownership stake in certain companies or monopolizing the market. These are the things that we need to think about more deeply, I think, to round out our strategy, because as you said, the military option alone is not going to get us all the way to where we would like to be when it comes to reasserting U.S. influence over the Western Hemisphere.
Okay, and let's just finally just bring it back down to Venezuela. So I can't remember who said it, but there was that memorable phrase, Pottery Barn rules. That you break it, you own it. Colin Powell. Okay, so does Pottery Barn rules apply in Venezuela? What's the worst case outcome here?
Well, I think, and I've argued in a piece for Foreign Policy magazine on November 6th, that the Pottery Barn rule would likely not apply if the U.S. engaged in limited airstrikes in Venezuela. If the U.S. does significant airstrikes in Venezuela, or the U.S. does boots on the ground, which we've discussed and likely dismissed in this conversation, then the Pottery Barn principle, you break it, you own it, would certainly apply. I think in this case, there's reason to believe that the Pottery Barn rule wouldn't apply with President Trump's likely MO. But certainly one of the worst case scenarios here would be the U.S. getting sucked into something that it didn't anticipate at the outset, something where the fallacy of sunk costs takes over, or boots on the ground. But I think those are some of the worst case outcomes that we hope don't come to pass.
Ryan, I've got to let you go. One of the joys of this gig is speaking to deep experts, and we've been really privileged to have you sharing some time with your precious time with us today. Thank you so much for what you've done, and for your time today. I've loved talking to you,
Patrick. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
So, Tom, that was my conversation with Ryan. What are your thoughts? What do you think is really happening here?
Well, Patrick, let me tell you a little story. First reported in the Wall Street Journal a few months ago that no one else really talked much about. I just thought was absolutely fascinating. I think opens a real window on Trump's thinking here. He decided to redecorate the Oval Office, take down some old paintings of the presidents he didn't like and put up presidents he did. And he put up, was beautifully spotted by a sharp-eyed Wall Street Journal observer, he put up a painting of someone called James Polk, who was a US president in the 1840s, a one-term president only. He's not one of the popular guys, the Roosevelts or the Lincolns that presidents like to hang. But Polk did something very interesting. He was, to this day, the US president that enlarged the United States more than any other. So he took Texas, he went right over to the West Coast, started taking states like Nevada, etc. And Trump loved that. And he loves Polk, and he actually at time called Polk a real estate guy. And clearly, this is the sort of frame and presidency Trump is modeling himself on. He's an expansionist. You just had a really interesting conversation about the Don Road doctrine. That is him. He wants to expand either America's territory or absolutely its sphere of influence as far as he can go. He's talked about Greenland. He's talked about Canada becoming the 51st state. And now he's talking about Venezuela. But here's the problem. This is clearly his ambition. His ambition is to effect regime change. It cannot be anything else. It's unlikely it's going to be a full-scale invasion. He just wants to get Maduro out and a friendly US government in. But he's not prepared to have a gritty war to get it. It was split MAGA down the middle. He'd get himself involved in another foreign war, which he campaigned on very, very hard to extract America from. So he wants something, but isn't prepared to go the full way to get it. So if his great big bid of applying pressure, vast amounts of it with aircraft carriers and strike jets and everything else, fails, and who knows, it may still just work and Maduro may be toppled or may walk. If it fails, I think he's left with a bit of a problem. He's basically left sitting there with this vast force bobbing around in the Southern Caribbean, looking a little bit silly without anything to do. And then you really do start to wonder what his pride, what his ambition may make him decide. How about you, Patrick? What's your takeaway on the situation, having heard it all now?
I find this really hard to call, Tom. So first of all, I agree with you with the so-called Dunn Road doctrine. I mean, it's a sort of snappy descriptor, isn't it, of something that does feel like Trump is shaping towards. You know, all of those early pronouncements that he made around Greenland, around Canada becoming the 51st state, around the Panama Canal, around the Gulf of America as opposed to Mexico, does suggest that he is focused primarily on his own backyard, on securing America's security. And of course, he's driven by, you know, the voters' concerns, which are primarily around immigration. And the immigration comes from the South and out of Central America and South America. So I think the Dunn Road doctrine metaphor does work for me. And I can't remember who said it to me the other day, but someone described what Trump really wants is a greater America. It is very much a real estate paradigm in the way that you were describing. I guess I'm stumbling over the legality of all of this. And I know we haven't made too much of it, but the idea that you would apply the law of armed conflict, which allows you to use violence as a tool of first resort as opposed to last resort in a law enforcement paradigm against a drug cartel. And it's not really a drug cartel, as we've discussed. This is the Cartel de los Soles, the cartel of the sun, is actually just a description of the corrupt bits of Maduro's regime. So it feels like a pretext to bend the law of armed conflict to suit their purposes, and I keep catching over that. And then I worry about the law of unintended consequences. So I think what we're seeing here is tactics, not strategy. I don't see this as a vehicle, as an approach that's going to win over South America. I see it as bullying in the backyard, albeit against an absolutely despicable regime, but a longer-term approach that doesn't just reach for the military instrument, but uses diplomacy, uses politics, uses economics to attract Latin America to this notion of a hemispheric defense and squeezes out China and Russia and Iran, and behaves in a way that treats South American countries as partners and not as pawns, feels to me like a better approach. And if the US do intervene military, and it is a big if at this stage, then I spent a good chunk of my career in Iraq, and I remember what the consequences were of winning a battle, but not thinking through how you win the war. And I don't yet see evidence of an end state that leaves a stable, democratic Venezuela behind. And that's, I guess, what I'm searching for.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And to your point, Maduro doesn't have any friends in South America, yet he seems to be gaining friends as a result of this. So the Colombians, for example, the other day said they're going to refuse to share intelligence with the Americans because they're worried about the legality of it all. And we know there's one thing poorer countries, less prosperous and powerful countries can rally around. It's a big bully trying to tell them what to do. We've seen that all over the world with different empires. So I think we agree, don't we? The propensity for this going bad for Donald Trump is fairly substantial. That said, if he pulls it off and ousts a dictator that 3 presidents before him failed to do, he'll be a hero. The stakes, I think, are pretty high each way.
So I'm just going to pick up that phrase you used there, empire. We've got to remind ourselves that history, human history, global history is a history of empires. And I think what we're seeing here is a much more assertive United States in its own backyard. This is an imperial gesture. It's an imperial action.
Okay, we shall watch this space very, very closely, that's for sure. And that is it for today. As always, please do reach out with any questions or thoughts you might have for us. Our email is generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. That's generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. We read every single one of them. We say it every week, but we really do, and they're hugely useful, so please do keep them coming. Also, do look out for the Times' War and Peace newsletter on Thursdays, written by yours truly, and free to Times subscribers. Just go to the newsletters page in your account to request it. Until next week, thank you for listening. Bye, Patrick.
Bye, Tom.